Hi, this is presentation number 5 on introducing qualitative research. The topics to cover in this presentation include the common characteristics of qualitative research, the types of data collected by qualitative researchers, and then 6 qualitative methodologies: case study, grounded theory, narrative methods, phenomenology, ethnography, and discourse analysis. So first, the characteristics of qualitative research. And your authors collect some other textbook authors of qualitative research have included other criteria, more and different criteria. So that's the first thing I want to tell you is that there is some consensus among some of the elements, and certainly all of the elements mentioned here, any qualitative researcher methodologist would agree with. But there are others. I just wanted you to know that there are other lists and that there are other things included in criteria. And then the different methodologies require some additional criteria. So these are basic common criteria for qualitative research. I would say that all qualitative research requires these criteria. The first is the researcher as instrument. And for people whose background or introduction to research has always been from a traditional scientific idea where the researcher is supposed to be objective and unbiased, it takes some unlearning to broaden the scope of what research can be. So, talking about the researcher as instrument, this is a very subjective, acknowledging a subjective position of the researcher, that all of the research, the formulation of the topic, the question, the design, the sampling, collection, analysis, and reporting, all of that flows through your primary research instrument, your instrument of interpretation, which is yourself. So there's far less distance between the researcher and the data. That's acknowledged. There's nothing to hide about that, and there's nothing wrong with that. This requires what we call reflexivity throughout the process, though, so that it's not just what you see, what you say, what you make of what you're doing. The danger is that you pass this off as what's really there. If continuously throughout the study you are accounting for your assumptions and your biases, talking about how your identity or your social positionality influences your interest analysis and representation, then that is, you've done what you need to do to be a responsible qualitative research. When you're creating research proposals, certainly for those that are part of a degree program, you're going to have to write a reflexivity statement, sometimes called a positionality statement, that's included in the research proposal. And it's also good practice to include a reflexivity or positionality statement in your research report. So the focus is on the context of research. This is something else that takes some unlearning and then broadening of what the purposes of research are. So in qualitative research, there is no need to make your the focus of your study or the results applicable to a broader context. The focus is on what can be learned of this specific phenomenon in this particularly situated context. So the researcher has some obligation to become intimately familiar with the context and to portray the context and reflect on how the findings of the research have to do with the context in which the phenomenon was observed. it's a recognition that human behaviors and actions aren't isolated from the environment. So there's always going to be some influence on the environment, and that includes all kinds of socio-political, cultural, linguistic um, backgrounds. And that's always going to influence beliefs, behaviors. Um, the requirement to focus on the context requires a writing style that is very different from a traditional scientific report. So one of the criteria not listed on here, but that other qualitative methodologists lists is some talent for writing. And if you do qualitative research, it's incumbent upon you to describe the research context in enough detail so that your reader gets a picture of the exact setting and what the people are there are like. So we say that you have to use a thick description of the research experiences, the participants. You have to make explicit the cultural and everyday practices that are observed. So when you see thick description, that means heavily detailed, explicit about um, all of the things that make the context unique. And then finally, or primarily, the findings aren't claimed to be generalizable. So when people are first doing qualitative research, I notice that they list as a limitation of their study that it's not generalizable. It's not a limitation of qualitative research. That's a foundational criteria. It's not meant to be. It's not desirable. The emergent research design. This is something else that um, differentiates qualitative research from quantitative or traditional studies. The research design evolves along the course of the research, and that's okay. And you'll notice that when you are filling out the IRB protocol, you'll be reminded again how that was based on a medical model, a scientific model that assumed that the design is already going to be decided and held rigid in place throughout the course of the study. And that's not the way qualitative research works. So the design could change, the methods could change even after the data collection begins. And it requires the researcher to be flexible to what they learn when they're observing on the site or when they're talking to participants. So an example could be adding more participants after new information is gained through interviews. Maybe you realize that there are several other people that you need to talk to, or maybe you're just not getting the information that you're looking for from any of your interview participants, and so you add more or add different ones. An inductive approach, and this has to do with the reasoning or how you come to understandings, conclusions, or even creation of theories. So you move from a specific to broader understanding. So move from very specific understandings of the context to deepen understandings about the phenomenon in general or about the participants in general. Um, so, for example, you might be studying the phenomenon of the rise of women in education at all levels until you get to the PhD. Men are still dominating at that level. Maybe you're studying that phenomenon, but you are going to build your understanding from the particular case of this group of women at this university that you have been following for X number of months. And then from whatever you understand about them, you might have something to reflect on about the phenomenon in general. It's not the same thing as making the study generalizable, though. Qualitative researchers often collect and analyze data concurrently. So maybe you start collecting your observation and interview data, and then you start writing about your understanding, right? So there's not just a discrete period of data collection and followed by a discrete period of analysis. So analysis, reflection, data collection, it's an iterative process. A theory, or at least a tentative local understanding, comes from the data. And that's how I started off explaining the inductive approach. And it's contrasted with deductive approach, which is the dominant assumed position of traditional scientific research, often using quantitative methods that test a theory or a broad understanding by looking at a specific context. So it's just the opposite of that. So page 101 in your text has a list of the common data sources that qualitative researchers use. So, and they would not exist apart from the researchers' efforts in generating them. So researcher-generated data include interview transcripts, observations, things that aren't at the site before you create them, your own notes, your own reflection on your participation, focus groups, informal conversations that you have. And then there's the naturally occurring data. So especially in case study, you are going to be looking at everything else that's already there. So the curriculum, reports, newspaper ads, posters, any physical artifact of the research scene. So if you look at table 5.2, you see them listed there. I think you can see them all the way down to the bottom. Visual data, for example, you can, photographs, video now. Video's become a more common data source, especially in phenomenological research. So qualitative methodologies, I teach from the Creswell text, and we talk about just 5 research methodologies. The one that we don't talk about too much is discourse analysis. I find that communication studies and counselor ed will use discourse analysis. And I guess because they are both different disciplines, departments from our own, that's not something that I felt was important to include. And I don't come across a lot of discourse analysis outside of communications and counselor ed. But so if you are interested in doing qualitative research, then you might want to take the 504 class that I teach. It runs every fall. We've changed the name to Decision Making with Qualitative Data, but it's an Introduction to Qualitative Research course. So the first one that your authors present is case study. Case study is something that I often use, but I vary it with other methods, and I was pleased to see that the authors of this textbook acknowledge that this is a methodology that can borrow from other methodologies. So a case in case study is a bounded system in which there's a set of parts or operations that work together to create the whole. So there are 2 folks whose work in explicating the methodology of case study has been useful for educators, and that's Robert Yin and Robert Stake. So Robert Yin quotes an earlier methodologist, Schramm, who says, case study tries to illuminate a decision or set of decisions, why they were taken, how they were implemented, and with what results. So a kind of a case study might be looking at the process of decision making that led to the creation of one department out of 2. A case study might be done on the events after a gunman killed people on a certain campus. And actually, Creswell does a study that way. Um, I've done a case study of a yoga program at an alternative support school in the Pittsburgh area. So case study is useful for descriptive or explanatory research questions. So what happened? Why did people do this? What was this all about? And it can combine with other qualitative methodologies. So I like to use some ideas from grounded theory to especially the idea of coming up with an explanation of why something happened or what exactly happened, and some variation of the coding method attached to grounded theory, which I'll explain a little bit. It also can fit well with a theoretical framework. I've used critical, I've used feminist, Jim LaPrade and I have used democratic lens. It's useful. It's okay. It's the types of case study. So this is the authors point out that they use holistic and embedded, and they give you a chart of what that might look like too. But Robert Yin, and this is far, I see this far more often as a description of the types of case study. He talks about exploratory, descriptive, and explanatory, and it kind of those types sound like what you might think that they sound like. So exploratory is going to be, what is going on here? That's the general question. What's going on here? Descriptive is describing an event, a process, something that happened, and then explanatory is close to grounded theory, where you're coming up to answer the question why. Why did this happen? The holistic or embedded refers to the focus of the phenomenon. So the holistic case study is looking at the entire case, however you bound your case. So whatever that is, maybe a case will be a consolidation decision in a particular school district from X year to X year, or maybe it will be a particular yoga teacher training program, or maybe a case will be a group of English language learners from Myanmar. Right? So, however you bound that, that's your lens. So, if you have a phenomenon within a case, the authors are calling this embedded. So, you're focusing on some aspect of the case. So, if you look at the example of school district consolidation, maybe you're just interested in the public referendum portion of that. And I sat on a dissertation committee where a doctoral student was examining exactly that. Some data sources for case study. Yin lists 6. Your authors list fewer than that, but this seems like a pretty good list from my experience. Observations, interviews, archival records. So, for example, that might be test scores. It could be behavioral data from school report cards. Documents such as reports and curriculum guides or news articles, participant observation notes. And so that's participant observation is a method where you are actually active in some kind of role in the site, but at the same time you're observing what's going on. So if you are delivering a particular professional development training to a group of teachers, you're the researcher, but you're also one of the instructors. So you are participating in that phenomenon that you're studying. Physical artifacts could be work samples, anything that the site provides to you, the physical environment, the environmental conditions, anything like that that you can study that are sources of data for your case. And then triangulation refers to, and other qualitative methodologies use triangulation too. I'm not sure why the authors associate it with just case study, but it just means establishing evidence across multiple lines of data. And you see try, so we tell students have at least three different data sources, but you can have more than three. And I guess the point is in case study, you usually do have more than three. So the authors describe different kinds of triangulation. So participant triangulation, so you're looking for the same theme that comes up in the interview transcripts of multiple participants or maybe across multiple focus groups. There's researcher triangulation. We sometimes call this inter-rater reliability or peer debriefing, where multiple researchers take a look at the data to see if they come up with the same patterns. Data triangulation is usually the understanding of triangulation when you see that mentioned in qualitative research, and that means using a variety of data sources. So what you're finding in your interviews is the same thing that you're finding in your observations, which is the same thing that you're finding in the curriculum materials and the news articles, and whatever other sources that you use. And then the authors talk about theory triangulation, which doesn't seem to me to be in the same category of kinds of triangulation. So maybe there's a better word for that, where a researcher might use different theories applied to a same data set. And I would think that seems more likely to be useful in grounded theory research. And here we have grounded theory research. So the seminal authors and those associated with the term grounded theory are Glasser and Strauss from 1965, sociologists. Grounded theory focuses on the development of a theory that is grounded in the data set. And this wasn't originally thought of as a qualitative method. For that reason, you might look to the 1960s and the work coming out of sociology as being the first step to recognize the kinds of things that qualitative researchers do as a kind of research, as a legitimate research methodology. It's been somewhat of a battle to get qualitative research recognized as research, as a systematic approach to analyzing data. But especially Glasser did not think that grounded theory was a qualitative approach at all. So originally the epistemological position was positivist, and the ontology had to do with one specific reality being out there. So Glasser and Strauss, their first work built from this epistemological position that we're objective and we're looking for the truth, and there's just one and it's out there. But then Strauss and Corbin sort of moved away from this position, and I would say most other folks using grounded theory are at least post-positivist, if not moving into constructivist. And we associate constructivist grounded theory as something markedly different from original grounded theory. And Sharmas is the methodologist to use for here. Sharmas says neither data nor theories are discovered but constructed by the researcher as a result of his or her interactions with the field and its participants. And I would say most of the grounded theory research you're going to read in education or in a lot of other fields right now is going to assume that that's true, that the researchers aren't finding something that's there, but actually constructing the theories. Data collection and analysis occur simultaneously, like they do with other qualitative methods of collection and analysis. But here, there's a very particular and strict system of analysis, and it starts with particular levels of coding, and it's called the constant comparative method. And it really means taking your data and putting them into categories and then rearranging them into other categories and then others and others and others until the level of categorization becomes saturated and you learn something from every arrangement. So it's really easy to do with Halloween candy. And when I taught qualitative research in a face-to-face environment, I had a guest speaker come in and put Halloween candy on the table. So you could arrange it by what was chocolate and not chocolate. That's my first go-to. That's what I would look for when I see a pile of candy. Things that are round, things that are oblong, things that are square. Then things that are red, things that are blue, things that are yellow, things that are created by Mars, things that are created by Hershey, things that are created by others. So there's different ways to group data, and that is a way of getting familiar, getting intimate with your data. So I provide a link for you to the constant comparative method, to a website that explains the different steps. But if you decide that you want to use this, I would say take a look at how Charmas has used it, or you can access either some of the original books from Glasser and Strauss or Strauss and Corbin. So kind of a new word here, maybe abductive thinking. In addition to inductive, so all qualitative research uses inductive, right, building from the local context to more general understanding. But abductive just alludes to a pragmatic way of looking at things. So you're looking for the simplest, most likely explanation. And then theoretical sampling is also central. So what it sounds like is what it means is throughout all the levels, from the formation of the question to sampling of participants to the collecting of data to analysis, there's always theories being floated and examined to see if they'll fit along anywhere along the process. And theories are adopted and theories are abandoned and new ones come in and go out throughout the entire research process. Okay, the next methodology is called narrative research. And the researchers here to look for are Clendenin and Connolly. Narrative could be an approach, a research methodology, and also the object of study. So you could use narrative as a method of collecting and analyzing and reporting, representing data. And a narrative can be that thing that you actually collect, study, analyze, and write about. Narrative explores how people make meaning of their lives through story. It's highly interpretive. Narrative is probably the last legitimized and then still questioned kind of qualitative methodology, and maybe it is more rightly referred to as a method of inquiry. That doesn't bother me at all. I consider that all the time. It's a legitimate method of inquiry. Comes from the humanities, from literature. Typically involves collecting in-depth interviews with participants who have experienced the phenomenon of focus, or it could be collecting their written stories as well. Could be collecting their spoken word poetry. Could be collecting documentary evidence, right? So you can now play with this idea of what it means to collect a story. So some of the methods, some of the data sources, and this comes from the Atlas TI website. And Atlas TI is a piece of software, I've linked to it there, that does a good job of helping to analyze data narratively. So looking for themes in the stories contained in these sources. You've got field notes, journal records, storytelling. So that could be oral, written, dramatized, letter writing, any newsletters, any kinds of texts, and pictures, audio, and video recordings as well. Restorying or retelling the story from a theoretical lens, from a historical lens, from a contemporary lens, from a philosophical lens, from the position of the researcher. It's an analytical process of gathering stories and restructuring them in relationship to time, place, plot, etc. So another, I would say, contemporary, easy to use, good model for narrative research, if you want to use it, comes from the Sage Handbook of Qualitative Research, Susan Chase. She writes a narrative inquiry, multiple lenses, approaches, and voices. So next we have phenomenology, and two guys here to use, and the focus of each is a little bit different. Phenomenology is a kind of philosophy. So we talk about the phenomenological approach. This is, again, right? Phenomenology, is this a research methodology? Is this a philosophical overlay to qualitative research? But it does contain a rather unique method of analysis. So either Van Manen or Moustakis. Phenomenology applies a philosophical perspective to the study of human experience. Phenomenology is always interested in the experience of something. So the general research question in a phenomenological study is, what is the experience of X? What is the experience of being X? What is the experience of doing X? So you're looking for a group of people who have shared a particular phenomenon, a lived experience of some kind. And then you focus on describing how the phenomenon is universally experienced, or looking for the essence of experience. Now, this is where some phenomenologists might differ. Some would say there is an essence to experience. That's right, basic essentialism. And some people say there isn't. So, what's it like to be a refugee from the Vietnam War in California in 1972? Right? What's that experience? Either there is an essence to it. Some would say, and I'm going to look for it. I'm going to collect as many stories as I can until I can distill the essence of what that's like. And some people say, no, that's not true. There are commonalities, there are ways to describe it, but different researchers will come to different conclusions about the essence. So in effect, there is no essence. So this process of research often begins by bracketing, and that means that the researcher is going to take their own interpretations, their biases, and their experience with the phenomenon and set that aside. Doesn't mean they're denying that they have an interest or a bias. It means they're recognizing it and writing about it and trying to root out all of those beliefs about that phenomenon that they have. They put it aside. It comes back in later when they do analysis of the data. Data collection typically includes 5 to 25 open-ended interviews, and you can have more than that. 5 is a little on the short side if you're looking for the essence of experience. And data analysis is undertaken with interpretive approaches, identifying common themes across a data set. So always acknowledging that the researcher is interpreting what participants have already interpreted about a phenomenon. So highly subjective. Not a limitation of the study, but actually fundamental to the methodology. Next, we have ethnography. This we get from anthropology. So this is using anthropological, social scientific methods just applied to education as the field of research. So ethnography is studying a particular kind of a group that has something in common together, which is funny that I don't think the authors really focus on this. So the original ethnographies were undertaken by anthropologists who were studying indigenous peoples on islands that, white Westerners weren't familiar with. So that's the idea of the name there of ethnography, study of an ethnic group. But it can be broader than that. It can be a study of other kinds of groups too. But common to this is that the researchers use the insider perspective rather than the outsider perspective. And this is something that has grown as researcher ethics have developed, because originally anthropological research was definitely written from the outsider's perspective. Several kinds of ethnography: realistic, critical, or post-critical. Realistic just means that the ethnographer is attempting to write the study so that the reader gets the feeling that they're right there. So they're take the position that they are just portraying things as they are. So they're trying not to insert their own interpretation into it. Some people say that's not possible. Critical ethnographers are going to say that's not possible, as well as post-critical ethnographers. Critical ethnographers are criticizing the default neutral or realistic ethnographers. Post-critical ethnographers are critiquing the critical ethnographers. Both the critical and post-critical ethnographers are bringing in the lens of critical theory as they're analyzing their study of whatever group it is that they're focusing on. But some common features of ethnography, no matter what kind you're doing: the research takes place in the field. So this isn't where you sit in an office and ask people who belong to a certain group to come in and talk to you. Although that could be part of it, there is some responsibility to go to the field, the setting, the environment where the group naturally operates. So for educational ethnographies, that's usually going to be a classroom. Or maybe it's an after-school program, wherever the people are naturally found. Data is gathered from a variety of sources. Data collection is relatively unstructured in terms of research design and data analysis. So you're just gathering as much as possible where you find it and when you find it. It's small scale, focus on just maybe a few cases or even one case, and not necessarily case in the bounded system that case study means it to be, but a few instances or a few groups. And I would suggest early researchers, novice researchers, focus just on one group. Data analysis is focused on interpretation of meaning and implications for local and then wider context. So another methodology, you'll find interpretation in all the methodologies, but here ethnography is focused on what the members of the group under study are making, what kind of meaning they're making of their experiences. Important to consider here is time, resources, and access. And ethnography can go on endlessly. A lot of times ethnographic projects turn into books instead of research reports. They really lend themselves to the format of the book. And then finally, discourse analysis. And like I said, this isn't something that comes up in common, but maybe you're interested in coming from the perspective of counselor ed or communications. Discourse analysis also not just counselor ed, but psychology in general might be wherever there's talk therapies involved. They're focusing on the study of talk and text. So what's going on in communication and discourse. So talk is the communication between humans, could be animals, I guess, as well, verbal, nonverbal interactions, and then text, very broadly interpreted, any kind of book, report, written, letters, emails, online discussions, documents, anything where there is text to be looked at. But of course, you can look at films as text as well. So, very interesting, their use of the term text. There are many different approaches, but three common assumptions here. First is that language is action oriented. Language is, it's not just a sound, it's meant to create an action, to um, move, even if it's just to move a conversation along, but it's a play, it's a move, it has meaning with regard to taking some kind of action. So language is constructed, so there are grammatical devices and linguistic resources. So, for example, use of pronoun. If we say, there's a difference between saying you're really a great group, or you've really failed this year, or we're a great group, or we failed this year. It sets the tone for the ontology of the situation, the reality there. So what's going on here? And then discourse is variable, so it performs different functions and changes with the audience. So if you're studying discourse analysis, chances are you're going to take a look at the communication function, or the performance of the text or the talk, if it's directed to one audience over the other. May include different types of data. If you're doing counseling sessions, it's probably going to stick with the counseling interview, but you can use several sources as well. And that's it. I wanted to include for you the chart on page 103. It's called a summary of the key characteristics of selected qualitative methodologies. So you can look across the top to see the 6 methods that these authors present to you, and then take a look at the research purpose, the primary data collection, and the example research question. I always found that charts like this were particularly useful for illustrating the differences in methodology when you take a look at the different questions that they might be asking. So there is a difference, for example, in grounded theory. What was the process of implementing instructional leadership in an urban school district? That's a very different question from an ethnography. What are the everyday instructional leadership practices of urban school principals? So if you take a look at the same topic and write the different questions about it, you can see how different methodologies would help you to answer very different questions.